In the winter of 1945, near the base of the Jabal al-Tarif cliffs in Upper Egypt, a man named Muhammad Ali al-Salman was digging for sabak, a nitrate-rich fertilizer. His mattock struck a sealed earthenware jar, nearly a meter high. For a moment, he hesitated, fearing that a jinn might be trapped within the clay. But the hope of finding gold outweighed his fear of the spirits. When he smashed the jar, no gold spilled onto the desert floor. Instead, 13 leather-bound papyrus books tumbled out into the light. One of these volumes, now known as Codex II of the Nag Hammadi Library, contained a text that had been erased from the visible world for 16 centuries. It did not begin with a genealogy or a miracle. It began with a quiet, unsettling claim: these are the hidden words that the living Jesus spoke and Didymos Judas Thomas wrote down. The discovery of the Gospel of Thomas changed everything we thought we knew about the early Christian movement. It was not a new discovery in the sense of a totally unknown name. The early church fathers had mentioned it in their lists of forbidden books for centuries. But until that moment in 1945, it was a ghost, a title whispered in warnings, a shadow without a body. When scholars finally opened the leather covers and began to translate the Coptic script, they found a document that defied the very definition of a gospel as it had been understood since the 4th century. There is no story here. There is no birth in a manger, no trial before Pilate, no crucifixion, and no resurrection. There is only the voice. 114 sayings, or logia, stripped of any narrative scaffolding. This is the gap where our certainty begins to fray. For nearly 2,000 years, the story of Jesus has been inseparable from the plot of the 4 canonical Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We are accustomed to a Jesus who moves through geography, who heals the sick, and who ultimately dies as a sacrifice. But the Jesus of Thomas is different. He is not a sacrifice, he is a teacher of riddles. He does not ask for worship, he asks for recognition. As we look at the translation by Bentley Layton, the language is stark and rhythmic. It reads less like a biography and more like a manual for an internal awakening. Saying 2 sets the tone for the entire work: let him who seeks continue seeking until he finds. When he finds, he will become troubled. When he becomes troubled, he will be astonished, and he will rule over the all. As we descend into the evidence, the friction between this text and the established canon becomes impossible to ignore. In the Gospel of John, the relationship between Jesus and the believer is vertical. Jesus is the light of the world, and he is the only way to the Father. But in the Gospel of Thomas, the light is something that already exists within the individual. In saying 77, Jesus says, "I am the light that is over all things. I am all, from me all came forth, and to me all attained. Split a piece of wood, I am there. Lift up the stone, and you will find me there." This suggests a radical immanence, a divinity that permeates the physical world and the human self, rather than a divinity that stands apart from it. Elaine Pagels, in her work The Gnostic Gospels, points out that this version of Jesus was deeply problematic for the developing institutional church. By the late 2nd century, leaders like Irenaeus of Lyons were working to consolidate a fragmented movement. Irenaeus argued that there could only be 4 Gospels, just as there are 4 winds in 4 corners of the earth. In his treatise Against Heresies, he attacked the countless number of apocryphal and spurious writings that he claimed were being used to lead the simple-minded astray. To Irenaeus, the Gospel of Thomas was a reservoir of wickedness. But why was it so dangerous? The danger lay in the source of authority. If the kingdom of God is a state of self-knowledge, if the divine is found by splitting wood or lifting a stone, then the entire structure of the church becomes optional. If every believer has a direct, internal connection to the living Jesus, why would they need a bishop? Why would they need a creed? The Gospel of Thomas suggests that the ultimate goal is for the student to become equal to the teacher. Saying 108 records Jesus saying, "Whoever drinks from my mouth will become like me, I myself shall become that person, and the hidden things will be revealed to him." This is a promise of union, not a call to subservience. It is a vision of spiritual democracy that the hierarchical church of the 4th century simply could not afford to tolerate. The turn in the story occurs when we realize that Thomas may not be a late, heretical corruption of the true Gospels, but a parallel tradition that is just as old. Many of the sayings in Thomas are nearly identical to those found in Matthew and Luke, yet they lack the editorial framing that gives them a specific religious spin. In the canonical Gospels, the parables are often followed by an explanation of how they relate to the end of the world or the judgment of sins. In Thomas, the parables are left open, hanging in the air, inviting the reader to find their own meaning. This has led some scholars to suggest that Thomas preserves an earlier, more primitive layer of the Jesus tradition, a layer that was more concerned with wisdom and insight than with the establishment of a new religion. The exclusion of Thomas was not an accident, it was a choice. In the year 367, Athanasius, the bishop of Alexandria, sent out an Easter letter to the monasteries of Egypt. He provided a definitive list of the books that were to be considered canonized and handed down as divine. He ordered that all other books, those he called secret or illegitimate, be rejected. It is likely that the monks at the monastery of St. Pachomius, not far from Nag Hammadi, received this letter and faced a crisis of conscience. They were ordered to burn the books they had studied and cherished. Instead of destroying them, someone chose to save them. They placed the books into a jar, sealed it with bitumen, and buried it at the base of a cliff. They entrusted the words to the sand, perhaps hoping that a future generation would be ready to hear them. When we read Thomas today, we are reading a ghost that has regained its voice. It forces us to confront the fact that the early Christian world was a much larger, more diverse, and more intellectually restless place than the history books usually suggest. It presents a Jesus who was more of a Zen master than a high priest, and a path to the divine that begins and ends with the self. The hidden words are no longer hidden, but they remain just as challenging as they were 16 centuries ago. We are left with the image of that sealed jar in the desert, a silent witness to a path not taken. If the monks had followed their orders and burned these pages, we would still believe that the history of the early church was a straight, narrow line, rather than a tangled forest of competing visions. The Gospel of Thomas does not offer the comfort of a finished story. It ends as abruptly as it begins, leaving the reader with more questions than answers. It asks us to look at the foundations of our own traditions and consider what was lost in the process of building them. It invites us to consider that the truth might not be something handed down by an institution, but something discovered in the quiet of one's own seeking. If the kingdom is indeed both within you and outside you, as the third saying claims, then what does it mean to look for it anywhere else?